In the 1980s, philosophers would sometimes speak of the beam, a metaphorical spotlight of intellectual brilliance that could illuminate even the most complex philosophical conundrums. Only some lucky philosophers were ever born with the beam, and their work represented the gold standard of the field. Anyone who lacked the beam was forever condemned to trail behind them intellectually. Sarah Jane Leslie would share this sort of story with André Simpian whenever they would see each other at conferences. The two were trained in different disciplines, Leslie in philosophy and Simpian in psychology, but they studied similar topics, so they would get together regularly to catch up on research and talk about their experiences as members of their respective fields. Psychology and philosophy are quite similar in their substance, and in fact, psychology was a branch of philosophy until the mid-1800s. But the stories they told painted a picture of two fields with vastly different views on what is important for success. Much more so than psychologists, philosophers value a certain kind of person, the brilliant superstar with an exceptional mind. Psychologists, in contrast, are relatively more likely to believe that the leading lights in their field grew to achieve their positions through hard work and experience. At first, philosophy's obsession with brilliance appeared to be a quirk, a little strange but innocuous. Other things seemed like bigger problems in Leslie's field, such as its inability to attract women and minorities. Despite sustained attention to issues of underrepresentation in recent years and some efforts to alleviate them, women still accounted for fewer than 30% of the doctoral degrees granted in philosophy in 2015. Only 1% of philosophy PhDs were Black. The field of psychology, on the other hand, has been quite successful in attracting and retaining women, who earned 72% of PhDs, and Black scholars earned 6% of its 2015 doctoral degrees. The discrepancy was jarring. These two fields have so much in common. Both philosophers and psychologists ask questions about how people perceive and understand the world, how they decide between right and wrong, how they learn and use language, and so on. Even the few salient differences, such as psychologists' greater use of statistics and randomized experiments, are becoming blurred nowadays with the huge increase in the popularity of experimental philosophy, in which philosophers conduct surveys and experiments to explore different perspectives on morality, for example. How could two such closely related fields be so vastly different in membership? A eureka moment came several years ago for Leslie and Simpian when they connected two threads running through the anecdotes they had been sharing. During dinner with a group of philosophers and psychologists at a conference, the conversation happened to turn, in quick succession, from philosophers' infatuation with brilliance to the gender gap in their field. This chance juxtaposition brought to mind for Leslie and Simpian a connection they had never considered before. Maybe the premium philosophers place on brilliance is actually the reason why so few of their colleagues are women or minorities. They did not discount the benefits of brilliance. Rather, they wondered whether genius was more easily overlooked in women and Black people. Insisting on a keen intellect in a particular field could be tantamount to hanging a "keep out" sign to discourage any newcomers. On the surface, an emphasis on brilliance does not favor one group or another. Cognitive ability is not tied to gender or race. Philosophers seek a certain kind of mind, regardless of whose mind it is. This seemingly logical preference quickly becomes problematic, however, in light of certain shared societal notions that incorrectly associate superior intellect with some groups, usually white men, more than others. Even among the academics present that night, one of the views expressed was that men and women just thought differently. Women were alleged to be more practical and anchored in reality, whereas men were more willing to engage in the kind of counterfactual, abstract reasoning that is viewed as a sign of philosophical brilliance. It seemed possible that such stereotypes, which amount to equating brilliance with men, might well dissuade women from entering a field that holds this quality in high esteem. Moreover, current members of such a field might themselves hold different expectations about the prospects of men and women and might evaluate and encourage them differently as a result. The same logic extends to race. The United States has a long history of portraying Black people as intellectually inferior, which is particularly likely to affect participation in a field that focuses so single-mindedly on the quality of one's intellect. Considering these stereotyped and inaccurate attitudes, philosophy's fascination with brilliance may reduce its diversity. Leslie and Simpian speculated about whether the implications of this insight might extend beyond their home disciplines. Talk of brilliance is common in academia, and, they observed, quite common in fields that have similar issues with diversity, such as science, technology, engineering, or mathematics. They wondered if their anecdotal comparison of philosophy and psychology might have something new to say about the underrepresentation of women and minorities in these disciplines. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that their brilliance hypothesis might also explain some of the variability in gender and race gaps among different scientific fields. For example, women make up nearly 50% of doctoral degrees in biochemistry, but just more than 30% of PhDs in organic chemistry. The difference cannot easily be explained by the content of these fields, which overlap considerably, or by their history. Biochemistry emerged from organic chemistry at about the same time psychology separated out of philosophy as an independent discipline. They wondered whether the demographic differences between such sibling subjects, as well as more generally among scientific fields, could be explained in part by the extent to which they emphasize exceptional intellectual talent as key to success. Their hunches quickly reminded them of the rich body of work developed by psychologist Carol Dweck of Stanford University. Dweck and her colleagues have shown that one's beliefs about ability matter greatly for one's ultimate success. A person who sees talent as a stable trait, or who has a fixed mindset in Dweck's terminology, is motivated to show off this aptitude and avoid mistakes, which presumably reflect the limits of that gift. In contrast, people who adopt a growth mindset see their current capacity as a work in progress. In other words, ability is a malleable quantity that can usually be increased with more effort and better strategies. For a person with a growth mindset, mistakes are not an indictment, but rather a valuable signal highlighting which of their skills need work. As Dweck has written, students with a growth mindset are not as worried about looking intelligent, and so they take on more challenges, persist longer, and are more resilient in the face of setbacks. In contrast, those with a fixed mindset tend to see challenges as risky and effort and setbacks as signs of limited talent. Although Dweck initially studied mindsets in individuals, she and Mary Murphy, now at Indiana University Bloomington, recently suggested that organized groups of people, such as companies and clubs, may also hold these sorts of views. Their research showed that people who worked for growth mindset businesses felt far more empowered by their company and committed to it. They said that their organization valued innovation and creativity much more so than those who worked for fixed mindset companies, and that it would support them if they took a reasonable risk that did not work out. They also found that the managers in growth mindset companies more frequently said that their employees showed the potential to rise and become stars, compared with managers in fixed mindset companies. Ironically, the fixed mindset companies, for all their emphasis on talent, were not seeing as much potential in their workers. Leslie and Simpian considered whether such views might permeate entire academic disciplines as well. The fascination with brilliance in philosophy and other areas could conceivably create an atmosphere in which displays of intellectual prowess are rewarded and imperfections are to be avoided at all costs. In combination with the stereotypes suggesting that genius is concentrated in certain groups, such a perspective could easily turn toxic for members of stereotyped groups. After all, it is easy to see imperfections and inadequacies in those people who you expect to have them. Leslie and Simpian decided to contact academic professionals from across a wide range of disciplines and ask them whether they thought that some form of exceptional intellectual talent was necessary for success in their field. They then looked up statistics on the gender and racial and ethnic composition of the people obtaining PhDs in those disciplines, which the National Science Foundation supplies on its website. Their hunch was that disciplines that place more value on brilliance would tend to have fewer female and Black PhDs. This pattern should hold not just at the macro level, when comparing the hard sciences, for example, with the social sciences and humanities, but also within these broad domains, for disciplines as similar as philosophy and psychology. More than a year and thousands of emailed surveys later, they and their collaborators, Meredith Meyer of Otterbein University in Ohio and Edward Friedland of Princeton University, finally had an answer to some of their questions. The responses received from almost 2,000 academics across 30 fields matched the distribution of PhDs in the way that they had expected. Fields that placed more value on brilliance also conferred fewer PhDs on women and Black scholars. The greater the emphasis on the single fixed trait, the fewer doctoral degrees were awarded to either of these groups. The proportion of female and Black PhDs in psychology, for example, was higher than the proportions for philosophy, math, or physics. Next, the researchers separated the responses in the physical and biological sciences from those in the humanities and social sciences. Analyses of these subgroups indicated that a stronger emphasis on brilliance correlated with fewer female and Black PhDs, regardless of whether we compared physics with biology or philosophy with sociology. It seems that the team had stumbled onto an explanation that was general enough to describe the representation of multiple stereotyped groups in fields across the entire academic spectrum. All they had really shown at this point, however, was a correlation between the presumed desirability of a fixed trait, brilliance, with the dearth of women or Black people in a given field. They had not yet demonstrated cause and effect. Certainly, many other plausible explanations for the gender imbalances have been proffered over the years, from a heavier workload that favored single men and those with wives who did not work outside the home, to a supposed female preference for working with living organisms as opposed to inanimate objects. The team carefully examined the most common alternatives. For instance, did their brilliance measure simply track differences between fields in their reliance on math? They looked at the math portion of incoming students' graduate record examinations, or GREs, as a proxy. Beliefs about brilliance still predicted women's representation above and beyond those scores. Similarly, they found no support for the common view that women are underrepresented in high-powered fields because they prefer a better work-family balance. The team asked the academics in their sample how many hours they worked per week, both on and off campus. Taking into account these differences in workload did not, however, reduce the explanatory power of beliefs about brilliance. This single variable still predicted the magnitude of gender gaps across the 30 disciplines. The team also considered the prevalent thought that women might be more interested in working with and have a better intuitive understanding of people, whereas men prefer inanimate systems. But an analysis of the many branches of philosophy, for example, that do in fact consider people and are still dominated by men basically blew up that idea. As often happens in research, this initial study made it clear how much was not yet known about the phenomenon being investigated. For example, it would be important to know if academics' beliefs about brilliance predict gender and race gaps at earlier points in students' educational trajectories. The team was very interested in testing their idea at the bachelor's level, which is the gateway to students' later academic careers. Do field-level messages about the importance of brilliance relate to the majors that female and Black students pursue? The answer to this question is yes, as they found when they analyzed anonymous student evaluations of their college instructors on ratemyprofessors.com. The team found that undergraduates were nearly twice as likely to describe male professors as brilliant or a genius compared with female professors. In contrast, they used terms such as excellent or amazing equally often for men and women on the popular website. Leslie and Simpian determined that the overall amount of talk about brilliance and genius in the student reviews, which is a proxy for the field's emphasis on those qualities, correlated closely with a lack of diversity in completed majors. Further research showed that non-academics share similar notions of which fields require brilliance. Exposure to these ideas at home or school could discourage young members of stereotypes groups from pursuing certain careers before they even set foot on a college campus. At this point, the team needed to investigate the development of these stereotypes. When do young people in our culture start thinking that some groups have more brilliant people in them? It could be that this stereotype emerges late in development after sustained exposure to relevant cultural input. For example, media portrayals of brilliance and gender-biased expectations from parents and teachers, professors, and peers. But evidence from developmental psychology suggests that children are cultural sponges. They're incredibly sensitive to signals in their social environments. In fact, youngsters in early elementary grades seem to have already absorbed the stereotypes that associate math with boys and reading with girls. From this perspective, we might expect that stereotypes about brilliance would also be acquired early in life. To explore this idea, the team asked hundreds of 5-, 6-, and 7-year-old children questions that measured whether they associated being really, really smart, which was the researchers' child-friendly translation of brilliant, with their own gender. The results were consistent with the literature on the early acquisition of gender stereotypes, yet were still shocking to them. At 5 years old, boys and girls showed no difference in their self-assessment, but by age 6, girls were less likely than boys to think that members of their gender are really, really smart. The researchers then asked whether these stereotypes might already begin to constrain boys' and girls' interests at such a young age. They introduced another group of 5-, 6-, and 7-year-olds to unfamiliar game-like activities that the researchers described as being for children who are really, really smart. They then compared boys' and girls' interest in those activities at each age. The results revealed no gender differences at age 5, but significantly greater interest from boys at 6 and 7 years of age, which is exactly where they saw the stereotypes emerge. In addition, the children's own stereotypes directly predicted their interest in these novel activities. The more a child associated brilliance with the opposite gender, the less interested he or she was in playing games for really, really smart children. This evidence suggests an early link between stereotypes about brilliance and children's aspirations. Over the rest of childhood development, this link may funnel many capable girls away from disciplines that our society perceives as being primarily for brilliant people. The hard work of figuring out how best to put all this information to use, how to intervene, lies ahead. But a few suggestions follow pretty directly from the evidence we have so far. Minimizing talk of genius or brilliance with students and protégés may be a relatively easy and effective way of making one's field more welcoming for members of groups that are negatively stereotyped in this respect. Given current societal stereotypes, messages that portray this trait as singularly necessary may needlessly discourage talented members of stereotyped groups. The changes may need to go deeper than talk, however, and tackle some of the entrenched systemic issues that encourage a field's fascination with brilliance. Refraining from mentioning the beam will not help young women in philosophy if the rest of the field's practices continue to be anchored in the idea that brilliance is all that matters. Another key takeaway is that we may need to intervene earlier than conventional wisdom suggests. Developmental data indicate that some of the psychological processes that work against diversity can be traced all the way back to elementary school and even before. In 2013, Carol Dweck and colleagues at Stanford and the University of Chicago examined how mothers praise their babies, analyzing videotaped interactions when the children were 1, 2, and 3 years old. 5 years later, when the children were in second grade, Dweck and her team assessed their mindset and appetite for challenge. They discovered that the mother's earlier pattern of praise predicted their children's mindset and their desire for challenge in second grade. The mothers who gave their children more process praise, focused on actions, persistence, or strategies relative to other forms of praise, raised kids with stronger growth mindsets and more interested in tackling challenges. In a follow-up study, Dweck found that this latter group of children continued to progress and showed higher math and verbal achievement 2 years later in fourth grade. Waiting until college to step in and ensure that all young people have a fair shot at finding the careers that might suit them no longer seems like the best timed intervention. We as a society would be wise to encourage a growth perspective as opposed to a fixed trait mindset starting in young children as well. There's another factor at play here, the question of whether intelligence alone is really the most valuable quality one can bring to a field in the first place. We all probably know someone who is intelligent but does surprisingly stupid things. As Heather A. Butler of California State University, Dominguez Hills admits, "My family delights in pointing out times when I, a professor, make really dumb mistakes." What does it mean to be smart or intelligent? Our everyday use of the term is meant to describe someone who is knowledgeable and makes good decisions. But the most widely known measure of intelligence, the IQ test, quantifies very different skills using visuospatial puzzles, math problems, pattern recognition, vocabulary questions, and visual searches. The advantages of being intelligent, as measured by an IQ test, are undeniable. Intelligent people are more likely to get better grades and go farther in school. They are more likely to be successful at work. And they are less likely to get into trouble, for example, by committing crimes, as adolescents. Given all the advantages of intelligence, though, you may be surprised to learn that it does not predict other life outcomes, such as well-being. You might imagine that doing well in school or at work might lead to greater life satisfaction, but several large-scale studies have failed to find evidence that IQ affects happiness or longevity. University of Waterloo psychologist Igor Grossman and his colleagues argue that most intelligence tests fail to capture real-world decision-making and our ability to interact well with others. This is, in other words, perhaps why smart people do dumb things. The ability to think critically, on the other hand, has been associated with wellness and longevity. Critical thinking is a collection of cognitive skills that allow us to think rationally in a goal-oriented fashion and a disposition to use those skills when appropriate. Critical thinkers are amiable skeptics. They are flexible thinkers who require evidence to support their beliefs and recognize fallacious attempts to persuade them. Critical thinking means overcoming all kinds of cognitive biases, for instance, hindsight bias or confirmation bias. Critical thinking predicts a wide range of life events. In a series of studies conducted in the US and abroad, Heather Butler and her colleagues have found that critical thinkers experience fewer bad things in life. They asked people to complete an inventory of life events and take a critical thinking test called the Halpern Critical Thinking Assessment. It measures components of critical thinking skills, including verbal reasoning, argument analysis, hypothesis testing, probability and uncertainty, decision-making, and problem-solving. The inventory of negative life events captures different domains of life, such as academic, for example, I forgot an exam, health, such as I contracted a sexually transmitted infection because I did not use a condom, legal, I was arrested for driving under the influence, interpersonal, I cheated on my romantic partner, financial, I have over $5,000 of credit card debt, and so on. Repeatedly, the researchers found that critical thinkers experience fewer negative life events. This is an important finding because there is plenty of evidence that critical thinking can be taught and improved. So, is it better to be a critical thinker or to be intelligent? Butler's latest research pitted critical thinking and intelligence against each other to see which was associated with fewer negative life events. People who were strong on either intelligence or critical thinking experienced fewer negative events, but critical thinkers did even better. Intelligence and improving intelligence are hot topics that receive a lot of attention. It's time for critical thinking to receive a little more of that attention. Keith E. Stanovich wrote an entire book called What Intelligence Tests Miss. Reasoning and rationality, rather than spatial skills and math ability, are generally what we mean when we say a person is smart. Improving intelligence is difficult. Critical thinking, though, can improve with training, and the benefits have been shown to persist over time. Anyone can improve their critical thinking skills, and doing so, we can say with certainty, is a smart thing to do.